Hello, everyone, and I hope you're having an excellent week this week. So, today we're going to be covering layer effects. Layer effects, sometimes also called layer styles or layer effects, are special effects that you can apply to an entire layer to produce specific visual effects. From drop shadows to outline strokes to exterior glows, Photoshop's layer effects and styles can be used for an array of purposes. Some of the most commonly used options include drop shadow, outer and inner glow, bevel and emboss, or color or pattern overlay. This tool is particularly useful when dealing with text or solid objects sitting above a background image or color, which makes it a frequent favorite of designers creating graphics for advertisements, web banners, or local flyers. So first, let's download our example photo for this lesson, View of Clouds by Eberhard Grossgatteger. Open it in Photoshop. First, let's set up a text layer to see how layer effects affect text. Similar to clipping masks, layer effects apply their effects on content and ignore transparency. They also work on both vector and pixel content, allowing you to use vector layer effects on text, shapes, selections, and any other layers. With that in mind, using the Type tool, create a new text layer with the words cloudy skies. Choose whatever font and size you'd like, as long as it is visible within this image. To get started using the Layer Effects tool, just select the small effects icon next to the name of any layer in the Layers panel. You can view the various layer effects applied to each layer inside the panel as well. You're not limited in how you use these effects. Each layer can have as many effects as you choose. You can see how the Layers panel looks with several layer effects active in the canvas box or on screen. Much like layers themselves, layer effect visibility can be toggled on and off by clicking on the eye icon next to the name of each effect. You can also turn off all layer effects by clicking on the eye icon next to the effects label underneath the affected label or affected layer. You can also move layer effects from one layer to another by clicking and dragging them on top of the layer you want them to be affected. If you want to duplicate the effects instead, you can hold down Alt on Windows or Option on Mac as you drag them on top of the new layer to duplicate these layer effects. Now, let's shortly go over all the different layer effects available within Photoshop. So you have Bevel and Emboss, which adds highlights and shadows to simulate depth. You have Stroke, which outlines the object with color, gradient, or pattern. And we went over the stroke tool a bit in the shapes lesson. We have Inner Shadow, which adds a recessed shadow just inside the edges of content. We have Inner Glow, which adds a glow that emanates from the inside edges. Next, we have Satin, which applies interior shading to create a sort of satiny finish. Next, we have Color Overlay, which fills content with a solid color. Then Gradient Overlay, which fills content with a gradient, and Pattern Overlay, which fills content with a pattern. Then we have Outer Glow, which adds a glow that emanates from the outside edges, and Drop Shadow, which adds a shadow that falls behind the layer contents. Now, if I were to go over all the different options available for each layer effect, this lesson would likely be over an hour long. So I'm going to cover the three I've used most often in previous professional work: Stroke, Color Overlay, and Drop Shadow. The rest use either very similar options to those three or have limited use in current design trends. If you're interested, as usual, I encourage you to take this chance to experiment with these other options, but I will also link videos in the Canvas description that cover these effects more fully. So firstly, let's go over the stroke layer effect. This layer effect has many of the same options that you may be familiar with from the shapes assignment earlier. We can control the size of the stroke, which is the width or size of the stroke. We can control the position of the stroke, which is whether the stroke should be rendered outside of the layer edges, inside the layer edges, or center the stroke along the edge. Then we have blend mode, which is the blending mode of the stroke. These are the same blending modes that you're familiar with from learning about layer blending modes. Then we have opacity of the stroke. And then there's an option there called overprint. Overprinting is a process that could deserve its own lesson. You can learn more about it in the article I linked in Canvas from Adobe, But in brief, overprinting will essentially print your stroke, in this case, as a transparent layer after all the other printing has finished. This can help prevent any press misregistration or gaps caused by the printer moving during printing. In short, you probably don't need to worry about this setting, but if you are printing something that has a fine stroke, you can use it, or you can just talk to your printer if you are worried about any press misregistration. Lastly, we have the fill type. This is what the stroke is filled with: color, gradient, or pattern. And depending on which one of these options you choose, you'll get a different set of options. Next, let's go over the color overlay layer effect. This layer effect is essentially the fill type option from the stroke layer effect, but applied to the entire layer. This can allow for easy testing of silhouettes, testing different colors on a font or shape, or applying blending modes to a specific layer without using a clipping mask. There are just a few options in this one, from the blend mode to the color to the opacity. Now keep in mind that changing the blend mode opacity, they don't affect the base layer itself, only this overlay. So if you have a base layer that is red and then you have a color overlay that's green, setting it to multiply will not create a transparent green as you might have expected, but instead will create a sort of muddy brown color because it's blending this overlay of green over the red. And the same with opacity. If you have a blend mode, is only affecting this overlay. Lastly, let's go over one of the more versatile layer effects with the drop shadow. Drop shadow is probably one of the most common layer effects in use. It can be used to create a sense of depth between shapes, as well as with application user interfaces or to create dramatic shadows for movie posters. By utilizing different blending modes, you can even make the outer glow layer effect essentially obsolete. So we have a lot more options in this one than the previous ones. So just like the previous ones though, we do have the blend mode of this shadow, the color of the shadow, and the opacity of the shadow. But what's new is the angle, and angle is where the light is coming from that is casting the shadow. And then there's this little checkbox that says use global light. Checking this will have all effects that use a global light, like bevel and emboss and inner shadow, use the same angle setting. So you can use this to create a consistent lighting for an object or layer. But if you leave it unchecked, you can create different effects. So experiment a bit to see how it works if you want. Then we have distance, which is the offset or how far away from the source layer the shadow will display. Then we have spread, which is the size of the shadow prior to blurring the edges. Next, we have size, which is the size and blur of the shadow. Then we get into the quality options, in which we have contour, which controls the fade of the shadow in a way similar to the curves adjustment layer. You can leave this on default, but if you want some different effects for your shadow, definitely you can mess with this a little bit. Then we have the little noise slide, in which this adds noise or like random pixels to the shadow. And then we have a option for layer knocks out drop shadow. When checked, the base layer will always obscure the shadow, even if the layer itself is transparent, such as with a shape with a transparent fill. I'll be showing this on screen now. So let's use our new knowledge of layer effects to create a mock-up of a website application dialog box with text and a button. First, let's crop view of clouds to a 1-to-1 ratio or perfect square. You can do this by holding Shift when creating your crop, or by selecting 1:1 from the ratio dropdown in the crop options bar. Then, since we're creating a web mockup, let's use the image size dialog to resize this image down to 1000 by 1000 pixels. If your initial crop was smaller than that, then I would suggest going back and adjusting your crop to fit 1000 by 1000 pixels. Now let's create our dialog box. Create a white rectangular shape in your image. Leave a decent amount of space around the edges so we can still see some of the background image, and later we'll also be able to see our layer effects that we will apply to this box. Feel free to adjust the corner radius or give the rectangle a stroke if you desire using these different shape options. Now let's center our rectangle in our background. Using the Move tool, you can drag the rectangle until it snaps to both the magenta lines that note the center of the document, vertically and horizontally. Alternately, you can select both the background layer and the rectangle layer in the Layers panel, and then click Align Horizontal and Align Vertical in the Move options bar. Now let's create the button we want at the bottom of our dialog box. Click the Shape tool and create a smaller horizontal rectangle within the larger rectangle. Choose a color for your button. I'm going to choose a sort of peachy orange to bring in some of those colors from the background. I'm also going to center it horizontally within the dialog box, but you could have it in the bottom left or bottom right corner as well. However, make sure to, again, to leave some space around it. We want to have that little bit of white space around our focus just to give it a little bit of space to breathe. Let's add some text to complete our document setup. I'm going to create two text layers, one reading Learn More for the button and one text box to fill in the rest of our dialog box. Photoshop should generate some filler text for your text box, but if it doesn't or you need more, feel free to copy text from this assignment or any other text that you have on hand to fill your text box. I'm going to do a bit of additional styling, such as changing my text size to 36 points and adding a 20-point space after each paragraph. These should help the text fit the space reasonably well. I'm also going to use the Align Horizontal and Align Vertical options in the Move options bar to center the button text within the button and center the text box within the dialog box. However, you will want to make sure that your text and your button don't overlap in a jarring way. Now that we've set up the basic blocks of our mockup, let's now use our layer effects to create a sense of depth and interest. I'm going to add drop shadows to both the button and dialog box and a gradient overlay to the button. You can use whatever effects you want on whichever elements you want, but try and maintain a good amount of readability for your text. I want you to use at least 3 layer effects in this mockup. You could use a bevel and emboss on the Learn More text to make the Learn More look like it is embossed within the button. You can use drop shadows like I did, or strokes. Maybe you want to add a gradient or some other effect. There's a lot of options you can do here, so feel free to explore and create something that is interesting and yours. Once you've created the layer effects that you want, save your file using our standard submission guidelines below. And once you've done that, just know that you have done some really excellent work today. And with that, I'm going to let you all go. And I hope you have an excellent week, and I will talk to you next time.